Let me ask you to do something unusual for a moment. Forget politics. Forget headlines. Forget everything you think you know about money. Instead, imagine this. Imagine waking up one morning in a country that still feels powerful, still looks wealthy, still speaks confidently about the future, yet quietly discovers that the rules it relied on for half a century no longer apply. No sirens, no announcements, no collapse, just a subtle shift. And then, slowly, life begins to feel more expensive. Opportunities narrow, choices shrink. Not because people became lazy, not because innovation stopped, but because a hidden advantage quietly expired. This story is not hypothetical. It has happened before, repeatedly. And it always begins the same way, with a privilege so powerful that the society enjoying it stops noticing it exists. That privilege is reserve currency status. And for the United States, it has been the foundation of modern prosperity far more than most Americans realize. For nearly 50 years, the dollar has enjoyed something no other nation in history possessed at this scale: the ability to print money that the rest of the world was structurally required to use. This was not an accident. It was engineered. And now, for the first time since the early 1970s, that system is beginning to fracture. Quietly, incrementally, but unmistakably. On March 15, 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it would accept Chinese yuan for oil sales to China. Not dollars, yuan. For most people, this sounded like a minor trade detail. In reality, it marked a historical rupture. Because the petrodollar system, the mechanism that forced global oil trade to be conducted in US dollars, was never about oil. It was about demand. If every country needs oil, and oil can only be purchased in dollars, then every country must hold dollars. That single rule created permanent global demand for US currency. It allowed the United States to borrow cheaply, run massive deficits, and export inflation instead of absorbing it. It was, quite literally, a free lunch. And history is very clear about one thing: free lunches do not last. To understand why this moment matters, we need to step back, far back, and examine a pattern so consistent that it borders on mathematical. Every global reserve currency in the last 500 years followed the same arc: rise, dominance, overextension. Alternatives emerge. Confidence cracks, acceleration, replacement. Not once, not twice, every single time. In the 16th century, it was the Portuguese real, backed by control of the spice trade and naval dominance. In the 17th century, it was the Dutch guilder, supported by the most advanced financial system the world had ever seen. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was the British pound, anchored by industrial supremacy and imperial reach. Each power believed it was different. Each believed its system was too entrenched to fail. Each was wrong. And now, whether Americans are ready to confront it or not, the dollar has entered the same historical sequence. Not speculation, not ideology, pattern recognition. Reserve currency status is not a trophy. It is a temporary condition that lasts, on average, between 80 and 110 years. The dollar has been dominant since 1944. We are now 80 years in. That alone does not doom it, but what matters is the state. And by every historical measure, the dollar has moved past the midpoint. The early stages are invisible to the public. The currency still feels strong. Markets still function. Living standards remain high. This is precisely why denial thrives. Because the collapse of a reserve currency does not begin with weakness. It begins with strength. Strength encourages overreach. Overreach creates resentment. Resentment motivates alternatives. And alternatives, once viable, spread faster than anyone expects. Before we go further, it's critical to understand what a reserve currency actually does. A reserve currency is the primary currency held by central banks around the world. It is used to settle international trade, price commodities, pay debts, and stabilize national currencies. When a country controls the reserve currency, 4 extraordinary advantages follow. First, permanent demand. Foreign governments, corporations, and banks must hold your currency, regardless of your domestic economy. Second, cheap borrowing. Global demand for your currency creates constant demand for your government bonds, allowing you to borrow at lower interest rates than fundamentals would justify. Third, seigniorage. You print paper. The world gives you real goods. Factories, oil, labor, resources, exchanged for currency created at near zero cost. Fourth, exported inflation. When you print too much money, inflation is diluted across the global system instead of being fully absorbed domestically. These advantages allowed the United States to sustain trade deficits for decades without immediate consequences. They allowed consumption to exceed production. They allowed debt to grow without crisis. But here is the rule history enforces without mercy. The more a reserve currency is abused, the faster alternatives are built. And alternatives are no longer theoretical. China has built its own cross-border payment system. Russia built one after sanctions. BRICS nations are openly coordinating de-dollarization strategies. Central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace since the 1970s. Trade is increasingly settled in local currencies. And the most important signal of all has appeared. Energy, the lifeblood of industrial civilization, is no longer exclusively priced in dollars. That is not structural. It is structural. Because oil was the anchor that replaced gold when the dollar lost gold convertibility in 1971. When that anchor weakens, the system floats, and floating systems drift. This is not about the dollar disappearing. That never happens. The Portuguese real still existed after its collapse. The guilder survived as a national currency. The pound still circulates today. What disappears is dominance. And dominance is what makes the difference between stability and adjustment, influence and reaction, abundance and constraint. The most dangerous misconception Americans hold is that reserve currency status can be lost gradually without consequence. History shows the opposite. The early stages feel slow. The later stages accelerate violently. And by the time the public understands what is happening, the outcomes are no longer negotiable. In the next part, we will walk through the exact 8-stage pattern that destroyed every previous reserve currency. Stage by stage, we will locate where the dollar sits today. And we will examine why this transition is likely to be faster and more disruptive than anything seen before. Because the question is no longer whether the system is changing. The question is whether people are paying attention early enough to adapt. Every global reserve currency that has ever existed followed the same structural life cycle. Not because history repeats itself out of habit, but because reserve currencies are constrained by mathematics, incentives, and human behavior. They rise not because they are declared dominant, but because they solve a real problem at the right moment in history. And they fall, not because they suddenly fail, but because the very privileges that make them powerful eventually distort the system that sustains them. This process unfolds in stages, not randomly, not emotionally, systematically. Stage 1 is necessity. A reserve currency emerges after a global disruption. In the case of the US dollar, that disruption was World War II. By 1944, Europe and Asia were physically devastated. Industrial capacity lay in ruins. Gold reserves were depleted. Trade systems were fractured. The United States, by contrast, held roughly 70% of the world's gold, possessed intact industry, and produced more than half of global manufactured output. The Bretton Woods system was not a political victory. It was a practical solution. The dollar was pegged to gold. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. Global trade needed a stable reference point. The dollar filled that role. At this stage, reserve currency status is stabilizing. It rebuilds trade, restores confidence, accelerates growth. History shows that this stage is beneficial not only to the issuing nation, but to the global system itself. Stage 2 is expansion. As global trade grows, demand for the reserve currency expands naturally. Foreign central banks accumulate it. Global contracts are denominated in it. Commodities are priced in it. This creates a reinforcing loop. The more the currency is used, the more useful it becomes. For the United States, this period lasted through the 1950s and early 1960s. Manufacturing boomed. Exports were strong. Trade balances were healthy. The system was disciplined. Because the dollar was still constrained by gold. Stage 3 is privilege. This is where the system begins to change. As demand for the reserve currency grows, the issuing nation gains extraordinary advantages. It can borrow cheaply. It can run trade deficits. It can finance wars and social programs without immediate constraint. Foreign nations recycle trade surpluses back into the issuing nation's bonds. This feels like prosperity, and in many ways, it is. But something subtle happens. Discipline erodes. In the US case, by the late 1960s, military spending and domestic programs expanded faster than gold reserves. The promises embedded in the system exceeded the physical backing. Stage 4 is detachment. This is the critical turning point. In 1971, the United States suspended gold convertibility. The dollar was no longer redeemable for gold. At that moment, every prior reserve currency in history would have collapsed. But the dollar did not. Why? Because it found a new anchor: oil. Through agreements with major oil producers, global energy trade was denominated in dollars. If a country needed oil, it needed dollars. This recreated structural demand. The petrodollar was born. This moment is often misunderstood. It was not the end of discipline. It was the postponement of consequence. Stage 5 is overextension. With no gold constraint and permanent global demand, expansion accelerates. Debt grows, trade deficits widen, consumption outpaces production. For decades, the US imported real goods and exported paper claims. Foreign nations accepted this because they needed access to the dollar system. But over time, imbalances grow. Manufacturing moves offshore. Financialization expands. The real economy shrinks relative to the financial one. This stage feels like dominance. Markets soar. Assets inflate. Living standards appear stable, but structurally, dependency is forming. Stage 6 is friction. At this stage, other nations begin to experience the downsides of the system. They must hold large dollar reserves. They are exposed to US monetary policy. Their domestic economies are affected by decisions made elsewhere. Resentment grows quietly. This stage is not ideological. It is mechanical. History shows that when reserve currency issuers use their position aggressively, through sanctions, financial coercion, or excessive money creation, alternatives begin to emerge. Not to overthrow the system overnight, but to hedge against it. Stage 7 is fragmentation. This is where the system begins to crack. Trade is settled in alternative currencies. Payment systems are duplicated. Gold accumulation accelerates. Confidence does not collapse uniformly. It fractures. Some actors move early, others wait. This creates volatility. Importantly, this stage often coincides with a strong currency. Because capital still flows to perceived safety. This confuses observers. How can the system be weakening if the dollar is strong? History answers clearly. Reserve currencies are strongest just before they lose dominance. Stage 8 is acceleration. Once alternatives reach sufficient scale, change accelerates. Not linearly, exponentially. Confidence shifts faster than policy can respond. Trade contracts change. Reserves rebalance. Interest rates rise. The issuing nation is forced to absorb inflation it once exported. Debt becomes more expensive. Living standards adjust. This is the stage history remembers. But it is not where collapse begins. It is where denial ends. So where is the dollar today? By historical comparison, the dollar sits between stage 7 and early stage 8. The petrodollar is no longer exclusive. Trade alternatives exist. Central banks are diversifying. Debt levels are historically extreme. This does not mean the dollar disappears. It means the era of effortless dominance is ending. The consequences are not abstract. Higher interest rates, higher import costs, reduced geopolitical leverage, greater internal trade-offs. This is how reserve currency transitions have always unfolded. The tragedy is not that they happen. It is that societies assume they are immune. In the next part, we will confront the most difficult question of all. Why this transition is likely to impact everyday American life far more than previous reserve currency declines, and why modern complexity may accelerate the adjustment rather than soften it. The most dangerous misunderstanding about reserve currency transitions is the belief that they are primarily financial events. They are not. They are social events, that express themselves financially. When a reserve currency begins to lose dominance, spreadsheets notice first. People feel it later. And by the time it becomes political, the structure has already shifted. This delay is what makes the transition so disorienting, because nothing appears broken, yet everything feels tighter. To understand how this unfolds, we must move away from abstractions and toward lived experience. Not hypotheticals, not extremes, but subtle, cumulative change. The first effect is not inflation. It is friction. A reserve currency allows a nation to live with unusually low friction. Imports arrive cheaply. Credit is abundant. Deficits feel harmless. When dominance weakens, friction returns. Not dramatically, incrementally. Trade partners become less willing to hold excess dollars. Contracts adjust. Hedging costs rise. These costs do not appear as headlines. They appear as price pressure. Goods that were once inexpensive become merely affordable. Affordable goods become discretionary. Discretionary spending contracts. Households adapt quietly. They delay purchases. They substitute brands. They rationalize adjustments. This is not collapse. It is compression. The second effect is interest rate sensitivity. For decades, global demand for dollars and US Treasuries suppressed borrowing costs. This allowed households, corporations, and government to carry higher debt loads with less strain. As global demand diversifies, interest rates become more sensitive to fundamentals. Debt must compete rather than assume demand. This has cascading effects. Mortgage rates rise. Credit becomes selective. Asset prices become volatile. Again, not overnight, gradually. The society feels more cautious. Risk tolerance declines. This shifts behavior. Businesses delay expansion. Households prioritize liquidity. Governments face harder trade-offs. The third effect is labor pressure. A reserve currency allows consumption to exceed production. Imports substitute for domestic manufacturing. Services expand. Financial sectors grow. As the currency's privilege erodes, this imbalance becomes visible. Imports cost more. Domestic production becomes strategically valuable again. But rebuilding production is slow. In the interim, wages face pressure. Not uniformly, not catastrophically, but unevenly. Some sectors gain leverage, others lose it. Inequality of experience widens. This is not ideological. It is structural. The fourth effect is psychological. This is rarely discussed. A reserve currency provides more than economic benefit. It provides narrative comfort. The sense that the system works in your favor by default. When that assumption weakens, anxiety rises. Not panic, but vigilance. People pay closer attention to prices, to policy, to risk. Trust becomes conditional. This changes social tone. Less optimism, more calculation. History shows that societies undergoing reserve currency transitions become more inward-looking, not isolationist, but cautious. The fifth effect is political strain. When structural advantages fade, politics absorbs the tension. Groups compete over adjustment costs. Narratives polarize. Blame circulates. This is not unique to any ideology. It is a feature of transition. Promises become harder to fulfill. Budgets tighten. Expectations clash with constraints. Policy choices narrow. The sixth effect is strategic recalibration. As financial leverage declines, other forms of power must compensate. Diplomacy becomes more transactional, alliances more conditional, commitments more selective. This does not imply weakness, it implies prioritization. History shows that reserve currency transitions force nations to rediscover limits, and limits clarify choices. The most important insight is this: none of these effects require collapse. They require adjustment. But adjustment feels uncomfortable in societies accustomed to privilege, because privilege is silent until it fades. The greatest danger is not economic, it is misinterpretation, believing that tighter conditions are caused by failure rather than transition, responding with denial rather than adaptation, treating structural change as temporary anomaly. History is unforgiving to such responses. The societies that navigated reserve currency transitions best were those that recognized the shift early. They did not attempt to preserve dominance at all costs. They adapted institutions, rebalanced expectations, invested in resilience. Those that clung to narratives of permanence experienced sharper correction. The United States now faces a choice familiar to history, not between strength and weakness, but between denial and adjustment. Understanding this moment clearly is not pessimism. It is agency. Because transitions reward preparation. In the final part, we will bring everything together. We will examine what history suggests remains possible at this stage, what cannot be preserved, what can be rebuilt, and how individuals and institutions can think clearly without fear, nostalgia, or illusion. History never ends systems with drama. It ends them with arithmetic. Long before currencies fail, before headlines change tone, before institutions admit strain, the math quietly stops working. Not suddenly, not violently, gradually. What made the petrodollar era extraordinary was not oil, it was trust. Trust that a single currency could absorb global demand without destabilizing its issuer. Trust that deficits could expand indefinitely without consequence. Trust that consumption could outpace production without eroding autonomy. For half a century, that trust held, not because it was eternal, but because the structure supporting it remained intact. Now that structure is changing, not collapsing, not disappearing, changing. History's most uncomfortable lesson is this: dominance does not end when alternatives exist. It ends when alternatives are trusted. That threshold has now been crossed. Trade conducted outside the dollar no longer signals protest. It signals normalization. Reserve diversification is no longer precautionary. It is strategic. Energy priced in multiple currencies is no longer symbolic. It is functional. These shifts do not require global consensus. They require scale. And scale has arrived. The mistake societies make at this moment is binary thinking. Either collapse or continuity. Either disaster or denial. History offers neither. What it offers is transition. Transitions are not moral judgments. They are structural reallocations. The question is not whether the previous era was good or bad. It was extraordinarily effective. The question is whether its conditions still exist. They do not. When reserve currency privilege fades, nations rediscover a reality long deferred. Trade-offs return. Choices sharpen. Constraints become visible. This does not diminish intelligence, creativity, or resilience. It simply removes insulation. For the United States, the end of the petrodollar's exclusivity does not mean decline is inevitable. It means adjustment is unavoidable. And adjustment favors seriousness. Seriousness about production, about savings, about investment horizons, about strategic independence. History shows that societies navigate these transitions best when they resist two temptations. The first is nostalgia, the belief that the previous order can be restored through willpower or rhetoric. The second is panic, the belief that change equals collapse. Both are forms of avoidance. What remains possible at this stage is not preservation of dominance, it is preservation of agency. Agency requires capacity. Capacity requires alignment. Alignment between finance and the real economy. Between education and applied skill. Between policy and physical constraint. These are not dramatic reforms. They are disciplined ones. They do not produce instant gratification. They do not generate viral slogans. They compound. History favors those who compound quietly. There is a deeper lesson embedded in every reserve currency transition. Wealth that arrives without effort eventually demands payment, not as punishment, as balance. The petrodollar era allowed the United States to live above certain constraints for decades. That era is ending. What replaces it will reward a different set of virtues. Productivity over leverage, durability over speed, coordination over consumption. This does not require pessimism. It requires clarity. The greatest advantage any society possesses during transition is understanding. Understanding transforms uncertainty into preparation. Preparation transforms adjustment into opportunity. The most dangerous position is neither optimism nor skepticism. It is complacency. History does not collapse societies that confront reality. It collapses those that protect narratives long after conditions have changed. If this examination has felt demanding, that is intentional. This is not content designed to entertain. It is designed to sharpen perception, to replace slogans with structure, to trade comfort for comprehension. If this perspective has added value, the most meaningful response is not agreement, it is engagement. A thoughtful comment that adds nuance, a question that pushes the discussion forward, a disagreement that challenges assumptions without abandoning rigor. That is how serious ideas remain alive. And if there is one person you respect, someone capable of thinking beyond headlines and tribal certainty, this is exactly the kind of material worth sharing. Not to convince, but to explore together. Because transitions do not announce themselves, they are recognized, often too late. Attention is the only advantage history offers in advance. If work like this matters to you, work that prioritizes depth over noise and structure over outrage, then staying connected matters, not as allegiance, as participation. History does not reward those who look away. It rewards those who notice early enough to still have choices.